Good, so good morning. St. Gregory of Nyssa says there are infinite degrees of perfection. So 2 days ago we had a perfect day on Bere Island. Yesterday we didn't see the sun at all, but it was still perfect in its own way. And today there's another kind of perfection. So I'd like to welcome you all back and welcome those who are joining us from different time zones and different parts of the planet. So we've been looking this week at the story of the Passion narrative and reflecting on it as it illustrates to us some of the essential meaning and the essential elements of what we call the human condition, what makes up life. And meaning is a very important part of life. If we lose meaning, we lose almost the will to live. There's a great book about the survival in Auschwitz and the death camps, and it identified one of the main reasons that people were able to survive during that terrible ordeal. And for him it was the Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. It was whether people had a meaning, a purpose, over and above just getting through the day and surviving from moment to moment, which was a big enough challenge. But was there a deeper or fuller meaning in life? And I thought today we could look at the next sort of stage of the story, of the narrative, which takes us into Gethsemane. So we've looked at those two elements of relationship, the anointing, that where we receive recognition and loving attention and tenderness, where we are known. And the other extreme, of course, Judas's betrayal. And these are two elements of human experience as far as relationships are concerned. Sometimes they may even be contained in the same relationship, or at different times, especially if relationships break down or go wrong. So, and then we looked at community, the importance of being able to see ourselves as part of a network of relationships, which is never going to be perfect. There will be aspects of that community experience, whether it's family or spiritual community or work community. There will be aspects of it where we do feel anointed by loving attention and care. But there will also be times of darkness, the shadow side of the human condition, where we will experience or feel that we are experiencing rejection. And sometimes it doesn't matter whether it's real or whether it's imagined. Real or imagined experience can be equally powerful. So you convince yourself, or you're convinced that somebody hates you and is hurting you and wants you out of the picture, and that may be quite illusory, in fact, but it feels like that. I remember once talking to two monks many years ago who had this terrible antipathy towards each other, and nobody could quite understand why they sort of seemed to reject each other so much, and they were always coming to me and saying, you know, that they're both gone to heaven now, so so they're meeting there. But they were coming to me and saying that they really felt so-and-so was really, you know, a good person, but whenever you hear that, you know there's something else coming. You know, he's a really nice person, you know, a really good person at heart. But so anyway, they were both actually convinced that the other one didn't want them there. And they would both say to me, I really think this is not the right place for him, you know, it should go somewhere else. So this went on for some time. Finally, I managed to get them together. And just in a conversation, as they learned to listen to each other, they heard the same thing. It was a mirroring, you know, this dark side of the relationship, and they, to everyone's relief, they became the best of buddies after that. So sometimes our feeling of rejection, our feeling of betrayal can be imaginary, like Othello, you know, convinced that Desdemona had betrayed him. Totally untrue, but nevertheless it led him to kill her. So whether it's real or imagined, it can be of the same level of intense suffering. So the story now takes us from the Last Supper, which we'll look at in more detail on Thursday, where these two elements come together. Because in the Eucharist, in the Last Supper, the Passover meal, we see friendship, companionship, communion, but we also see this element of darkness. Judas is there, and Judas leaves the supper to go off and do his task. So then after the Last Supper, Jesus goes with his companions to the Garden of Gethsemane, across the Kedron Valley. If you've heard this story from childhood, you may have felt like me that the phrase Kedron Valley had this exotic. Did you ever feel that? It's kind of got this. You feel that? Yeah, it's Kedron Valley. It sounds, you know, like the Grand Canyon or something like that. But actually, the Kedron Valley, it runs. It's a long geological formation, but at that point in Jerusalem, it's just a little dip. Really, it's sort of like crossing the road almost. So it's not quite as dramatic as it sounds. But of course, it is a drama that is unfolding. So he goes to this little estate called Gethsemane, where he had gone before on many occasions, apparently, for prayer. And some years ago, when I was there with a pilgrimage, we went and meditated in Gethsemane. So everybody moved around the garden and chose a little place of their own to meditate. And we were told that I think there were 4 or 5 olive trees there, which are 2,500 years old. So it was quite moving, actually, to sit there and see what Jesus would have seen. Presumably it was a smaller tree at that time, but it brings the physical reality behind the story to light. And I was also quite moved by seeing on the ground these little red flowers. I don't know what they're called, but I had seen them previously when we were in Galilee on the Sermon on the Mount, or the Mount of the Sermon. And so Galilee was, of course, Jesus' home area where he was at home. And you could imagine that moment where he gave his teaching to a receptive and sympathetic audience. And it was there that he speaks about the lilies of the field, what we translate as the lilies of the field, the little flowers that have a glory, he says, which surpasses all the glories of Solomon. So, and those were the same flowers in Gethsemane as I remembered seeing in Galilee. And I thought if they were there on that night when Jesus went there, he must have seen them and felt the connection. So these are elements, little details of the story that bring it home to us and make it possible for us to sympathize, to empathize with the suffering that he went through in Gethsemane. The word Gethsemane has become a byword for suffering. So I thought that today we could look at that element of the human condition, which is suffering, and reflect on it before we meditate. So suffering comes in many forms, physical and psychological. And the meaning of suffering is a central question of the human condition. What does it mean? Why should we suffer? Why should I be suffering? And it's a central question of all religious consciousness. I mentioned the Buddha begins his teaching with this statement that life is suffering and affliction, but there is a reason for it, and there is a cause, and there is a solution, or there is an ending of suffering. And clearly, in these days, the last days of Jesus, the Passion, we are confronted more and more intensely with his own suffering. And in his suffering, if we are able to listen to the story, in his suffering, we have the opportunity to face this question in our own lives and to find the meaning that we need to live through that reflection. It's not reflection, really not just in the sense of thinking about, but reflection in the sense that he reflects our experience. We see our experience in him and his experience in us. And that's the whole meaning of spending the time we are doing on the story, on the narrative. It's to allow that, as it were, mutual reflection to take place. And in terms of Christian faith, this takes us through the human experience of Jesus, connecting with our human experience into the deeper mystery, the deeper reality of his nature, of his meaning for the world. So there are all kinds of suffering, and all of them perhaps awaken in us different levels of anxiety or anguish or physical pain. And perhaps behind them all is this fundamental anxiety about death, the fear of death. Death seems to be the greatest suffering. We are often prepared to put up with a lot of suffering in order to stay alive. So to survive is the ultimate goal in one sense. It may not be the ultimate goal, but it often feels as if it is. And we will do anything or undergo anything in order to remain alive. And suffering always awakens in us this fear of death. So in the Passion narrative, which gathers momentum in the Gethsemane episode, we focus upon Jesus' passage through suffering. Passover, Passion, passage. The word passion, it doesn't mean emotional intensity. It means going through, passing through. And the passion here is involves the passing through this tunnel of suffering. When we are in intense suffering, whether it's due to loss or to some new accident that has happened to us, we feel that we're at a new stage on the road, and often it feels like a tunnel which obscures the view around us. We can't see anything else. In intense suffering, that's all we are aware of. Toothache, you know, there's only one thing, was really bad toothache. You know, the bigger questions of life just contract into this fixation upon the pain. So with Jesus we can identify this element of the human condition, our passage through pain, suffering. And here it's all the more intense and disturbing because it is undeserved. You know, even if you got a bad toothache and it was your fault, well, not your fault, but it was, you exacerbated it by not going to the dentist every 6 months or every year as you were supposed to do. You denied something, and eventually the denial broke down and you had to face the reality. And, you know, in terms of health even, we might say, you know, we don't look after ourselves, we don't take a little bit of exercise, we don't eat wisely, then eventually the body is going to give us feedback on that. So, but not all kinds of suffering have that kind of cause or responsibility. And in the suffering that Jesus is going through, we can say he did not deserve it. And it is not accidental either. It's not just that he was walking across the road and tragically got hit by a car. It's not an accident, nor did he deserve it. So what is it? It's made all the more painful because he is an innocent victim, a totally innocent victim. All he did was to tell the truth. And this brought down on him the wrath of the authorities. I just am reading at the moment, or have been for a few weeks, a long biography of Franz Kafka. And Kafka was a rather obsessive, compulsive individual, and not much happened in his life except in his head and in his one or two intense relationships. But what he had was a compulsion to write. And out of his rather, you might say, neurotic kind of personality and the compulsiveness came a major force of literature in the 20th century, and we can still read it. And this expression, Kafkaesque, captures in many ways what modern life has developed for us. The dehumanization of bureaucracy, and also the sense of oppression, the feeling that many people have today, and the cause of much mental suffering, the feeling that life as we live it, through the institutions we've created and so on, is getting at us. So in one of his great works, The Trial, this innocent person is picked up by the police, examined and put on trial without even knowing what he's on trial for. So it's a nightmare of paranoia, but the paranoia is justified. You wake up and you say, actually, there is somebody after me, and they are actually threatening my very existence. So I think when we look at the passion of Jesus, we see, in a way, a kind of Kafkaesque nightmare taking place, in which an innocent person is selected. The finger is put on them. They become a scapegoat. This is a very important theological idea for understanding the passion. And the high priests themselves even speak about Jesus as a scapegoat. It is better that one person should suffer for the people than that the whole people should suffer. So that sounds okay theoretically, unless you happen to be the scapegoat, in which case this full dark force of being selected unfairly. Life is deeply unfair in this. So, and this first comes to become fully exposed in the scene in the Garden of Gethsemane. Just before we look at that, just to say one other way that may give us a handle or a distinction that helps us to understand the meaning of what we are contemplating. Simone Weil, who knew what suffering was in her life, physical suffering and as well as mental suffering, Simone Weil makes a distinction between suffering and affliction. Suffering, whether it is a toothache, or whether it is even the loss of a beloved person in your life, always has some kind of physical manifestation. So when you're suffering grief, you have a heavy heart, or your heart is broken when somebody betrays you. So there's a physical component even to something that is essentially emotional or psychological. But affliction is a little different. Affliction does always, she says, have a physical component as well. But the difference is that affliction takes over complete control of all parts of one's life. Physical, psychological, and social. And it involves, as we see in the narrative of the Passion, social degradation. So the person is not only rejected, but degraded in the social network. In what should be a community for them, they become a degraded person, as happened progressively in Nazi Germany, as the Jews were degraded, not allowed to serve in professional life or academic life, and eventually, of course, by stages, turned into a dehumanized person. Do it by stages, and it's easier to get people to accept it. And then, of course, the more degraded they are, you think about the prisoners in Guantanamo Bay, couldn't be more degraded socially than they were, then it becomes much easier to abuse them. And what we find difficult to understand or imagine, or certainly to watch, is the cruelty, the sadism of nice people who take the opportunity to inflict additional suffering and humiliation on those who've already lost everything and any right to complain. So, And this is, you know, we see this in Guantanamo Bay, we see it in Srebrenica, we see it in the Nazi camps. This disturbing relationship between the degradation of of human beings, which also degrades the people who have control over them. They become, in their own way, although they're the oppressor or the torturer, they become degraded in their humanity. And we see this, essentially we see this in what happens after Gethsemane. The trial, the scourging, and the crucifixion. So Jesus is at the center of this. So he's going through a very real part, not a part we like to think about too much, but we need to think about it at least this week, an essential, integral part of the human condition. Slavery, of course, is the classic example of this affliction, where the slave, the individual, has absolutely no dignity or right, is excluded from the community of humanity, but is forced to serve it. And when we speak about Jesus as the suffering servant, in the phrase that Isaiah uses and that gives us a handle on the meaning of Holy Week, the suffering servant, maybe it would be better to say the slave, because a good servant may still have rights and may, you know, be looked after by their employer. So servant is a little softer, but the idea of a slave is very different. So affliction has a physical element of suffering. We see that in the Passion narrative. In the film The Passion of the Christ, which I haven't seen, I think there's a 20-minute scene of the scourging. And some people love the film. I couldn't bear the idea of going to see it, so I haven't seen it. So anyway, it seems to me to exaggerate, or not so much exaggerate as isolate, the physical component of the suffering of Jesus in a way that actually the gospel story doesn't. There's no sort of lingering over the terrible physical suffering that Jesus would have gone through. But there's no compulsive voyeurism about it either. It's there and you feel it. You can imagine to some degree what it would be like to be crucified or to be scourged or have thorns put around your head. But the Gospels don't linger on that. What they give us is a picture of the whole passage that Jesus is going through. It has a physical component, his affliction, but he has been excluded from his own community by power, by the authorities, and betrayed or abandoned by those who were his closest community, his closest friends. So it's affliction in every sense of the word that Simone Bay describes it. It's difficult to see affliction in others sometimes, because what may be affliction for me may not be affliction for you. And it's difficult to see in others unless we look at them with a different kind of vision, an other-centered way of seeing. And the worst example of not seeing like this is where you just tell someone who's maybe suffering depression, come on, get over it. come on, just, life isn't so bad. Just get up and, just count your blessings, which is a pretty unperceptive way of seeing the suffering of others, which for them may be a profound form of affliction. So we have to see, in a way, through the eyes of Christ. We have to see not just with our own perception and with our own quick judgment and dismissal of others, but we have to develop this contemplative gaze, which is linked to true compassion. Compassion is not pity. It's not just feeling sorry for someone. With pity or feeling sorry for, there's always this element of, oh, it's terrible. But, brackets, thank God it's not me. Which is why I was driving along the highway the other day and suddenly the traffic got quite slow, congested. So I thought something must have happened. And what actually happened was that there had been an accident. But the cars involved in the accident had been pulled off the highway. So the highway was quite free, but everybody slowed down to have a look. I don't know, I can't judge everyone who drove past, but whether that was compassion or something else. You can be voyeuristic about other people's suffering. We say the right thing usually, and think that we're feeling the right thing, but there is always this little element, thank God it wasn't me. Anyway, it's difficult to identify affliction in others unless we see with the eyes of Christ, with the eye of the heart, let's say. Otherwise, they may just seem crazy or peculiar or eccentric or funny, and we easily dismiss them from our consideration in that way. And because of that, and because affliction is always disturbing to us, when we do come into its presence, we may laugh at them as well. We make fun of them, which only adds to the affliction. It's hard to feel compassion for those in affliction. It's easier with more obvious forms of suffering, where you even may be able to do something about it, or medical or psychological, or even just to be with someone when they're suffering is doing something about it without having to solve the problem for them. But when real affliction is present, it is almost impossible to do anything, because this person is out of reach, is out of touch. They're no longer in the community. They're on the other side. And when that happens, we ourselves are disturbed because, of course, we're seeing something that we don't want to see or imagine. But when compassion does flow towards someone who is afflicted in that way, it feels like a miracle, because you're connecting across this huge distance, this huge abyss, with someone who is on the other side, out of community. And in the Christian, the tradition, especially from about maybe after the 12th century, the 13th, 14th century, a form of prayer, a form of devotion developed, which focused upon the suffering, upon the passion of Christ, upon the suffering he went through. And this is reflected suddenly in the kinds of crucifixes that we see. Maybe it was related to the ordeals of the 14th century that Europe was going through with the Black Death and 100 Years' War and half the population wiped out. Anyway, there was this new focus upon the physical suffering of Jesus in Christian prayer and devotion. And when we look at it now, we often feel it's a little bit over the top, a little bit too extreme. You look at in the Spanish world, you know, the images of the crucifixion, the focusing in the Philippines as well because of that, where they actually crucify somebody every year. There is it seems over the top, too much is disturbingly dark. And it may well be, certainly for us. But there's also some value, I think, in contemplating the suffering of Jesus, not in the way that it becomes obsessive or compulsive, as seems to me in some of those forms of devotion or films, but in a way that allows us to identify ourselves in and through what he is going through, and it gives us, therefore, a liberating insight into this strange and dark aspect of our human existence. So it can be, it's not that you get stuck in all of this blood and gore and pain and sadism. You can do, because it has a dark fascination, but it actually becomes a key to help you into an insight into its meaning. So let's just look at this passage in the Gethsemane. When they reached a place called Gethsemane, he said to his disciples, "Sit here while I pray." And he took Peter and James and John with him. So they all went with him, but only a few he took with him. These are the three he always takes with him into special moments where he needs his sort of executive committee with him. Horror and dismay came over him. And he said to them, and note that he said to them, "My heart is ready to break with grief. Stop here and stay awake." Then he went forward a little, threw himself on the ground, and prayed that if it were possible, this hour might pass him by. "Abba, Father," he said, "all things are possible to you. Take this cup away from me, yet not what I will, but what you will." He came back and found them asleep. And he said to Peter, "Asleep, Simon? Were you not able to keep awake for 1 hour? Stay awake, all of you, and pray that you be spared the test. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak." Once more he went away and prayed. On his return, he found them asleep again, because their eyes were heavy, and they did not know how to answer him. The third time he came and said to them, "Still sleeping, still taking your ease. Enough. The hour has come. The Son of Man is betrayed to sinful men. Up, let us go forward. My betrayer is upon us." So, he's in a community, and in his intimate community, but he is going through what will become affliction. You might say he hasn't quite, he's on the cusp of going into affliction. And part of the sign of that is that although he's with this close community, they're not with him. They can't even stay awake and be with him. They drank too much wine at the dinner, maybe. And they just can't stay awake. And we fall asleep sometimes just to escape difficult moments or great grief. We just go into a deep, dark, dreamless sleep. In any case, we see him, he goes a little bit away from them, not too far away, to pray alone, and then comes back and realizes he's been more alone than he thought. And he had said to them, so this is not just something that's going on in his head, he was able to say to them, I am desperate. My heart is breaking with grief for what is happening and what is going to happen, what must happen. Now, at this moment, he prays. St. Matthew says he goes back, each time he goes back, using the same words as before. So I think this is not just petitionary prayer, in a way, but this is how it is expressed. So he prays to Abba, which is the intimate word for Father, that if there's any chance that the script can be rewritten and he can avoid this, please let it happen. But then says, if it can't, then your will be done. So there's still a sense of connection here with the Father. And he's not blaming the Father. He's not judging the Father. He's not angry with the Father for making this happen. He still feels connected. The Father here, when the Dalai Lama was asked, what question would you like to ask Jesus if you could meet him? And he said immediately, what is the nature of the Father? It's not a question that many Christians have ever thought about, probably. So what is the nature, the personal nature of the Father? We anthropomorphize, we turn God into another human being, and so we get angry with God because God let this happen. But in this connection that Jesus has with his own source, it's a personal source, personal connection. The Father, we could say, is the ground of being. This is the ground, but the personal ground in which everything happens. And so he's now in touch, he still feels in touch with the personal nature of this ground of his being. But it doesn't intervene and, like a godfather, and make things better. So he's still going through the passage, or the tunnel. This sense of connection seems to be broken on the cross, where he expresses his experience of abandonment. Anyway, we'll come to that later. So, what do we see here in the Garden of Gethsemane? We see his fear of death, and not only the fear of the suffering involved before he dies, but the beginning of the realization that he is going to lose everything. Every aspect of his identity is going to be touched and changed by what he will go through. He will be in affliction. And the exchange he has with what he says to his friends, his disciples here, how you read that, what kind of tone of voice you imagine he was using, is up to you, really. Is he berating them? Is he accusing them? I always feel a little irony in what he's saying. But anyway, that's another kind of imagination. But what he's saying is, stay awake. And this is crucial, I think, to understanding the meaning of suffering. What suffering we can avoid, we should avoid. What suffering we cannot avoid, we have to face, confront, go through, and stay awake. It doesn't mean to say we can't take, painkillers, but it means that the painkiller we take should be appropriate to the spiritual meaning, or the deeper human meaning of what we are going through in the suffering. In other words, what we easily do is distract ourselves. And distraction is a form of not staying awake. It's a form of allowing ourselves to fall asleep. And we may distract ourselves with the TV. We may distract ourselves with drugs or drink or, hyperactivity. Very common for people, for us today. Just we get busier and busier and busier. We run away from the suffering that we should need to be confronting. And with meditation, I think we have this way of staying awake. And very often, when we are suffering, this afternoon we'll look at other, forms of suffering, psychological suffering, or especially. When we are suffering, those are often the times where we will say, I can't meditate. I just can't do it. I sit down to meditate and all the grief wells up inside of me. Or I sit down to meditate and this dark depression just grips me. I can't face it. And if you can't, you can't. But the truth is that if we can meditate as best we can, and this is not a condemnation of us if we can't, but if we can meditate as best we can during those times of suffering, or fear, or loss, we actually go through the tunnel more quickly. Meditation doesn't solve your problems. I have some problems with the water in my house at the moment. And I would love to think that when I sat down to meditate, the leak would be cured. And when I got up for meditation, everything would be working perfectly, and I wouldn't find another leak. But it doesn't work like that. What it does do is that you can look at the leak and say, well, it's a leak. It's not going to be the end of the world, and I'll get through this week. And my cousin, who's been helping me very generously, is very, very consoling, because he has a very practical approach to these things, and he always says, we'll fix it. Now, it may not be fixed today or next week, and some other problem may arise in it, but it's very important to be reassured that it's not the end of the world. And sometimes things that you go through feel like the end of the world, whether it's plumbing problems or losing your passport on the day before you go off on a trip, or even the greater tragedies and losses of life. So to be able to pray in this deeper way, not please solve the problem while I'm praying, or make it go away, but help me to go through this. Or the prayer itself is not a prayer to be helped, because the prayer is the help. That is what you need. And that gives you the strength, it gives you the perspective, it gives you the common sense to be able to keep it in perspective and to go through it. And I think in an intense way this is what we see also in this Gethsemane moment of prayer. And there's a shift in the mood or in the way Jesus is speaking. From before the prayer, my heart is breaking. I am overwhelmed with dismay and grief. I can't bear this. And after the prayer, even though he's discovered that the disciples have been pretty useless, he has a new strength, doesn't he? And what would otherwise have become depression, when you suffer enough, you can go into a depression with grief or anything. But we don't see depression in Jesus here at all. He's got a lot of energy. He says, up, let's go forward, we've got something to do. You know, not looking forward to it, but he's engaged with it in a different way. So meditation in the same way, if we can do it, and if we have the support of others who may fall asleep, and you may fall asleep during meditation, but if on the whole you have this support of a community to help you through these times and to continue meditating through these times, it gives you a way of dealing with the problem. It gives you a perspective on the meaning of your suffering. Okay, so let's end this section with from the Upanishads again. And then we'll take a little break before we meditate. This is from the Isha Upanishad. There are demon-haunted worlds, regions of utter darkness. Whoever in life denies the spirit falls into that darkness of death. The spirit, without moving, is swifter than the mind. The senses cannot reach him. He is ever beyond them. Standing still, he overtakes those who run. To the ocean of his being, the spirit of life leads the streams of action. He moves and he moves not. He is far and he is near. He is within all and he is outside all. Whoever sees all beings in his own self, and his own self in all beings, loses all fear. Good. So let's stay in the silence, and we'll take a couple of minutes before we meditate now. Good. So let's move into meditation now. And second. So we'll move into meditation now. We can listen to these words from the Isha Upanishad to take us into it. I think we better wait for a moment.
It was just one bathroom because the other was locked.
Okay. So this is from the Isha Upanishad. Who sees all beings in his own self, and his own self in all beings, loses all fear. When a sage sees this great unity, and his self has become all beings, what delusion and what sorrow can ever be near him? The Spirit filled all with his radiance. He is incorporeal and invulnerable, pure and untouched by evil. He is the supreme seer and thinker, immanent and transcendent. He placed all things in the path of eternity. The face of truth remains hidden behind a circle of gold. Unveil it, O God of light, that I, who love the true, may see. So again, take a moment to adjust your posture so that you can more easily stay awake. Your back straight, relaxed but alert. Relax the muscles of your face, your forehead. Close your eyes lightly. Just be aware of your breathing for a few moments. Then gently begin to say your mantra in your heart, in your mind, gently without force. Ma, Ra, Na, Tha, Ma, Ra, Na, Tha, with attention, listening to it as you say it, and returning to it faithfully. Whenever you become distracted, just drop the thought and return to the word.